Hey guys, welcome back to anatomy class. Super excited for us to get back into the swing of things. Hopefully we're going to learn a lot together. Remember, I'm still learning as well, so if I do mess anything up, please give me grace, but feel free to ask me any questions that you have, either between 9 and 11 a.m. on Tuesday, or between 2:45 and 3:45 at my office hours on Tuesday as well. So to get us started, this is our agenda for today. It's pretty light to lean back into the work. We're going to start with some notes, and then we're going to do something called a hematocrit investigation. I want to show you all the documents before we dive into the notes. So first thing you're going to want to do is open up this note sheet. It will be attached in Google Classroom, and make a copy. So you just hit File, then you're going to go to Make a Copy right here. And you'll make your own copy of the notes. That way you can type as you go through. What I suggest then is that you split screen between the notes and the slides so that you can get everything that you need. Now, your actual assignment for today after we complete our notes is to do a hematocrit investigation. We'll talk more about what that is when we get into the notes. But basically, you're going to use this ruler over here unless you have your own. Feel free to use your own if you have it because this might not be as accurate, to measure the percentages of plasma, which is the light pink, versus the blood, which is red. And that's going to help you calculate the amount of red blood cells versus total volume and get that hematocrit percentage for each of these 4 patients. Once you complete that, you're going to turn that in, and I will be grading those on Wednesday. So make sure that you get those in by 8 a.m. Wednesday. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so like we just said, all we're doing today are some basic notes to introduce us to blood. We're now entering the circulatory system, but before we can get into big picture, we want to start off a lot smaller. Then you guys will do your hematocrit investigation, turn that in, and then Thursday we'll continue with this unit. So before we dive into the actual content, this is a career that a lot of students tend to be interested in. So the person who takes your blood is called a phlebotomist. Anyone who's trained to do it can do it. And to do that, they have to get a phlebotomy certification. So this can happen in a clinic, like your doctor is technically a phlebotomist. This can also happen if you're donating blood with the Red Cross. All right. Now, the primary function of blood is to transport substances throughout the body and help us to maintain homeostasis. People who are afraid of blood, we refer to that as hematophobia. So remember, the root phobia here means fear. Hema means blood. When we're talking about blood, we're talking about something more complex than a lot of us think about. So blood is a connective tissue. Blood is a tissue, and a lot of people don't make that connection because they think of cells individually. Blood has 2 basic components. So in blood, we have the actual cells, like red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, but those actually make up less than 50% of your blood. The rest of your blood is actually made up of something called plasma. So plasma is water, proteins, amino acids, other things that are essential for the body, but it looks kind of just like a clear liquid in the bloodstream. Now, to figure out the actual percentages of blood, we place them in something called a centrifuge. You guys have seen this in my classroom. It's that little machine that spins things in circles that my AP Bio students use when they were doing, testing food concentrations. So when you put things into a centrifuge, the heavier stuff settles to the bottom. So it spins in a circle, and through centrifugal force, it separates out the 2 things. Here in this hematocrit tube, you can see the plasma will always aggregate at the top. The white blood cells and platelets kind of form a little coat right here in between the 2. And then the red cells will aggregate at the bottom. From this, we figured out that in the average person, you're going to have about 45% blood cell and then 55% plasma. That can change with each individual, and sometimes doctors do a hematocrit test to see how much of your blood is actually blood cells so that they can figure out if you have any disorders. So when we're looking at blood, there are three major categories of blood cells. You have the erythrocytes, those are the red blood cells. We all know them. We all love them. The leukocytes, which are your actual white blood cells, those are these right here. And then thrombocytes, which are the platelets, these little goopy looking ones. When we're talking about red blood cells, they're pretty distinct in that they have this biconcave disc shape. What that means is they've got divots or concave sides on both sides of the cell. So if we flipped it over, we'd see a divot on the other side as well. In one single drop of blood, there are actually 5 million blood cells. So you have billions of blood cells circulating throughout your body. The interesting thing about red blood cells is that they don't actually have a nucleus. So I wanted to ask you guys a question and see how you thought that DNA is extracted from our blood. So we know on crime shows, they'll take a sample of a suspect's DNA. What do you think they're looking at if they're extracting blood and trying to figure that out? Feel free to pause. I'm just going to pause for a few seconds and then I'll give you the answer. So red blood cells don't have a nucleus. We know that that the nucleus is where DNA is stored. So when they're extracting your blood to do a DNA sample, they're actually looking in your white blood cells, which do have nuclei. The next thing you need to know is hematopoiesis. It's a very fun word to say, but this just means the way that blood cells are created. Blood cells aren't actually made in our bloodstream. They're made in the middle of our bones and our bone marrow, which we've talked about before. And then our liver, this guy right here, is responsible for destroying blood cells that are no longer functional. So they do that through a process called phagocytosis. That's when cells eat other cells. Now, there is an advantage to having more red blood cells, right? We know that the average concentration is actually less than 50%, but this is an article on Lance Armstrong, who was stripped of a medal that he won in the Sydney Olympic Games. The reason for that is he had an interview with Oprah and he talked about how he used a performance-enhancing drug to improve his cycling abilities. The drug in question is something called erythropoietin. What it does is it increases the production of red blood cells. If you have more red blood cells, you're able to circulate more oxygen throughout your bloodstream, but it can also cause your blood to thicken and can increase your risk of a stroke. So now let's talk about what those blood cells do. So the main function of red blood cells is to actually transport oxygen throughout the body and remove carbon dioxide. I want you to think back to like our second unit, so we'll see who remembers, but what part of your cells actually need oxygen to function? So you have a hint here on the slide just in case you didn't remember. This guy right here, the mighty mitochondrion, is responsible for producing energy, and it does that through the use of oxygen. The next part that's important is a protein in our blood called hemoglobin. So this combines with oxygen in order to oxygenate our bloodstream and pass that through. And the reason it's called hemoglobin is the reason that your blood kind of tastes like metal if you've ever like bitten your lip, because iron is the binding site on oxygen. So there's iron in hemoglobin, and that allows our blood cells to bond with oxygen. When we're talking about oxygen levels, there are two categories that our blood oxygen can fall into. So oxyhemoglobin is when we have tons of oxygen. This is when the blood is bright red. And then deoxyhemoglobin is when you are low in oxygen, and that's when your blood is kind of a darker color. I think we've talked about this in this class before. You definitely heard it in bio, but remember that blood is not actually blue. The reason it looks blue in our veins is just because of our skin. So if you put a filter over it, it kind of has that bluish tint. But blood can be one of two colors, and they're both types of red. This blood on the left is oxygenated blood. That's one that's gotten a lot of oxygen. The one on the right is when they've taken blood directly from a vein. So there's no oxygen present in it, and that's why it has this darker ruby color. Now, when we're making red blood cells, there are a couple elements that are key for this. The first is folic acid. vitamin B12, and iron. You can get all of these from your diet, but you can also take them in different dietary supplements or vitamins. So this over here is just a B12 supplement that someone could take. And if you have too few red blood cells, you might end up anemic. So people who are anemic often eat a iron-heavy diet, which means they eat a lot of meat in order to counteract that. Our next major category are white blood cells, and this is where things kind of get a lot more complex. So their job is to protect our body against disease, and there are 5 different kinds of white blood cells. They fall into 2 major categories though. So you have the granulocytes. These are the ones that have a cytoplasm that's kind of grainy, and those include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Then you have your agranulocytes, which don't have that granular cytoplasm, and those would be monocytes and lymphocytes. We're going to talk about each in detail, so make sure you're following along in that table in your notes. So, white blood cells are found in your bloodstream with the red blood cells. There are not as many white blood cells, and usually they're a lot bigger. So this is just giving you an example of the different types of blood cells relative to the red blood cell. So first up, we've got our leukocytes. Any white blood cell is also called a leukocyte. Remember, they fall into these 2 categories, and in those categories, you have different types of blood cells. This shows you the general distribution of each of those types of white blood cells, neutrophils being the most common, lymphocytes the second most, and then the least common are our basophils. So a neutrophil has a nucleus that generally has a lot of different lobes. So if you look at these cells here, the dark colored part is the nucleus, and you can see all these different lobes coming off of it. These are the active phagocytes. What that means is they are going around through your bloodstream, just gobbling up cells that no longer work properly, and also eating invaders in your bloodstream. Because of that, they make up about 60% of our white blood cells. And if you've ever had a wound that has pus in it, you're going to have neutrophils in there. The pus excretes them to the surface so that they can consume more of the invaders or infection. This is an electron microscopy image of those neutrophils in action. So the yellow here is the neutrophil. And what it's doing is phagocytosing, which is a really fancy word for cell eating, the anthrax bacilli right here, the orange. So they literally just suck them up and then destroy them on the inside and release those particles back. Next up, we have the eosinophil. Sorry, I made that bigger for some reason. So eosinophils look like this over here on the left. Instead of having multi-lobed nuclei, they actually have multiple nuclei. And their main job is to attack parasites that get into your bloodstream. So they're much bigger because they have bigger things to tackle, right? This is a schistosome worm. That's something that an eosinophil might actually absorb. And then we have our basophils. So basophils look like this right here. They produce something called heparin, which is what thins our blood. Some people have to take blood thinners in order to reach an appropriate level of thinness. Remember, if your blood gets too thick, you could have a stroke. So heparin is responsible for maintaining the thinness of the blood. They also produce something called histamines, which are really important in your inflammation reaction. If you've ever had an allergic reaction or a mosquito bite, the thing that makes it swell is the histamine. Some people overreact with their histamine production though. So here are 2 examples of that. On the left, there's something called dermatographia. This is when your immune system releases excess histamine, so a ton of it, and it causes welts to appear when you have light scratches. So this woman who has it chose to write something on her skin just so you could see what that process looks like. There's also histamine production in response to temperature changes. So this person has cold hives or cold urticaria, and basically if they touch something cold, then they produce these welts in response because of an overactive immune system. Next up, we have monocytes. So the monocytes are these super big cells here. They have a horseshoe-shaped nucleus. The cool thing about monocytes is they haven't differentiated yet. So they can become macrophages, those are the ones that go around and just gobble things up, or dendritic cells, kind of like neurons, where they have the tails coming off of them and communicate. So they are responsible for phagocytosis, which is eating other cells, but also presenting antigens if they go the dendritic route. What that means is they produce the antigens that help the body recognize invaders and attack them. And then finally, we have our lymphocytes. So the lymphocytes have a really dark nucleus and it takes up almost the whole cell. There's a lot of DNA stored in them. In all of the lymph nodes in your body, remember we talked about how the doctor will feel your neck? You have lymphocytes. And these are your main defense for your immune system. So they produce something called antibodies. Those are integral in fighting off infection. And because of that, the lymphocytes are the second most common type of white blood cell. So you can see the difference here. Remember, neutrophils are the most common. You can see the lobed nuclei right here on the right. And then lymphocytes are the second most common, and their nucleus is just gigantic, so it's really easy to identify those. Next up, we have our thrombocytes. Remember, this is our third category of cells. So we're no longer in the immune system. We're talking about our final category, which is the platelets. Platelets are responsible for blood clotting. So if you ever get a cut and then you get a scab, that's because of the platelets. And they also repair blood vessels. Remember we talked about how plasma actually makes up a large portion of the blood, more than the actual blood cells. The liquid portion of blood is 92% water. So this plasma over here is almost entirely water, but it also has a lot of nutrients and then different vitamins and proteins that are necessary for all of these different cells to function appropriately. When we're talking about plasma proteins, these are the ones that are located in that plasma fluid. You have three major categories. The first are the albumins. These ones help to regulate blood pressure. So if you've ever gone to the doctor and they've used a blood pressure cuff on you, the albumins are responsible for helping to increase or decrease blood pressure. Then you have your globulins. These guys are responsible for moving antibodies throughout your system. So once a cell presents those antibodies, the globulins are going to carry them through your bloodstream to find other invaders. And then you have your fibrinogens, which are responsible for clotting. So albumins are going to increase blood pressure. Fibrinogens are going to clot your blood if you have a cut. This process of actually regulating blood flow, especially if you have an open wound, is called hemostasis. So this has the same root here as homeostasis, but this is in relation to blood. That's what hemo means. So this stops bleeding, and the way that happens is through a process called coagulation, where your blood clots and then seals that wound shut. There are three major parts here. Sorry, let me find a good place for my face. So when you have an injury, you can see it in this image on the right. The first thing that happens is your blood vessels spasm. So they open and close really quickly and they contract like that. They do this through the release of serotonin. Remember, that's a chemical that's produced in your brain, but it's also a vasoconstrictor, which means it's going to tighten up those blood vessels whenever there's a wound. So the vessel contracts because of the production of serotonin, and then platelets come along and they plug the opening shut, which you can see right here. The final phase is coagulation. Coagulation is when the fibrin actually starts to form. You can see these kind of like strings growing over the platelets, and it reinforces the close of the wound. So when you get a scab, that's because your blood has coagulated to close that wound up. In your blood plasma, you have a chemical called thrombin, which actually is responsible for the clotting of that blood. So what it does is it takes fibrinogens, remember we talked about those in the plasma, and actually produces the fibrin, which are these fibers right here you can see forming. Remember, coagulation is just the thickening of blood to form a clot. I can link this video if any of you are interested, but it just shows you what we just talked about. And when we're talking about these, there are two ways that this goes down. The first is thrombus. This is when your blood clot isn't normal. You can see it over here. And then embolus is when the clot moves to a different place. So both of these are malfunctions in the clotting system. If you have a thrombus, then your clot is clotting on both sides, and it's not in response to a wound. You just have a buildup of blood, and then the platelets think that there's an issue, and you clot inside. An embolus is when the clot moves to a different place. So there's two major categories that end up in hospitalization. The first is a pulmonary embolism. The word pulmonary relates to your heart. So you have a blood clot, to your lungs. So you have a blood clot that is in your bloodstream and it moves to your lungs. When that happens, it makes breathing difficult. And then we have cerebral embolisms. Remember, cerebral, the brain. So when a blood clot moves to the brain, and those are the most deadly and devastating. And with that, we finished our slides. So the last thing I want you to do is you're going to go down here to the bottom of your notes and answer these 6 quick check questions, just so I know that you got what we needed to get out of these notes. After that, you're going to go complete your investigation, and then you will turn that in, all of it, on Google Classroom. Remember, feel free to message in the comments and ask me questions, or email or text, whatever you need to do, but I want to make sure you understand what your expectations are. So again, notes are turned in on Classroom completed. Your investigation is turned in on Classroom completed as well by 8 a.m. on Wednesday. Thanks, guys.